It's my absolute pleasure to present the George A. Sutherland Award to a man I admire, a man I respect, a man who is truly a voice of our time, Ian Rowe.
So let's get started, because Ian, people may feel like they have now met you. They have indeed, but there's so much more to know about you. So I'd like to put some of what people just heard into a proper context. You are by every standard an academic, but you are not an ivory tower academic. Talk a little bit about where your ideas come from, how you test them, how you develop them, how they hit the ground and impact lives.
Well, thank you, Rick. And first of all, thank you for this incredible honor. It's quite humbling to receive an award which I don't think I've yet earned. So I'm taking it and committing to you to earn it multiple times over the next, hopefully 4 to 5 decades of my life. And I also am honored to be aside Lowry Snow. He's an incredible, incredible man. In terms of the context, you know, I very much like to think of myself as someone who tries to demonstrate virtues in action. That it's very easy to pontificate and to talk about ideas, but what happens when ideas intersect with the real world, with real people, with real kids, with real challenges? And I often find that there's a wide disconnect between those people who are thinking about policy or programs, oftentimes related to the most underprivileged or disadvantaged, and you think of these ideas in the comfort of academia or a think tank, but rarely venture out and actually see if these ideas work. And so that is a lot of what I do. So I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which is incredible. But when you come with me to the Bronx on Beach Avenue, you know, in the Soundview section of the Bronx, it's very different than the beautiful offices at AEI, but the two worlds need to intersect and inform each other. And I'm seeing this throughout the country, where this disconnect is just happening, you know, in New York City. So I went to a specialized high school in New York City. In New York City, you have to take a test to get into one of the top high schools, Stuyvesant. I went to Brooklyn Tech. And a few years ago, and when I went to Brooklyn Tech, it was an amazing, vibrant experience. You had to study really hard to get in, and we had, in my view, a very multiracial, socioeconomic diversity in the school. And it was amazing, and over a number of years, in my view, the degradation of the K-8 system really subsided in New York. And a few years ago, the mayor was unhappy with the sort of racial makeup of the specialized high schools. And so instead of really focusing on improving the quality of the K-8 education or building more great high schools, his solution, well, let's just eliminate the test to allow students to get into the high schools. And it's a really dumb idea, right? Because rather than focus on what is wrong with the preparation of all kids that's not allowing them to surpass an objective standard, the answer isn't to remove the objective standard. And so it's happening in Oregon. A few months ago, the governor made a decision to eliminate the requirement to demonstrate proficiency in math and reading in order to graduate from high school in the name of equity. These are really bad ideas, and I think they might have well intentions behind them, but they have really bad consequences for kids. So I try to think about my work as tested in the real world.
Thank you. You know, Ian, I think it's a confusing time to live in, because we're trying to address issues of equity and achievement and opportunity, and sometimes people get lost in the language, right, or what they hear on newscasts, or what they read on social media, which is not a great source. I'd like to offer the audience an example of what your analysis can mean in real terms. You always demonstrate this principled insistence around data and fact. And there's something in your book that is a perfect example of this. In chapter 2, you literally turned the results of a report on its head, a study by the Federal Reserve Board on consumer finances, by looking at it through a proper lens. Would you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, this is actually a fantastic example. I'm glad you've raised this. So in the United States today, there are these purveyors of the narrative of the country just being inherently oppressive, inherently racist, and the evidence that's usually trotted out, you're just supposed to hear it and accept it and not challenge it. And in particular, that is applied to the racial wealth gap. So if you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, it shows that the wealth of the average white family is about $160,000 more than the wealth of the average black family. The data is there. And for some, that's irrefutable proof of both historic and present day discrimination of black people in the United States. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, who some of you might know, she's the lead author of the New York Times 1619 Project, uses that as proof. She wrote an 8,000-word essay called What is Owed in the New York Times Magazine. And in it, she says, it doesn't matter what a black person does. Doesn't matter if you get married, doesn't matter if you get college educated, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you save. None of those things, in Nicole Hannah-Jones' view, can overcome, quote, 400 years of racialized plundering. Well, guess what? Nicole Hannah-Jones has done all 4 of those things in her life to lead a quite prosperous existence. And also, guess what? When you take into account just 2 other factors, family structure and education, the whole relationship changes. The wealth of an average married, college-educated black family is about $160,000 more than the wealth of an average white single-parent family. So the reason that's important is that, maybe there are factors beyond race that are within the control of young people that they can achieve dramatically different outcomes, right? But if the way in which you obtain and maintain power is to spread these narratives of inherent oppression, then folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones and others will continue to rail on, this is the story, this is the gap, end of story. And even though the name of my book is agency, probably the most important word I want you to leave with tonight is the word courage. Because we live at a time when it takes great bravery to say obvious things. And so when people give you ideas like this, well, the racial wealth gap is X, end of story, there's actually more to the story. And you have to have courage to confront those ideas. Because recognize, you're not alone. You're not alone. And the folks who are spreading these narratives are counting on you to be silent. Don't allow that. Courage.
The last time I interviewed Ian, it was over Zoom.
It was.
This is a lot more fun. I like this better. I want to ask you about, well, 2-part question. You mentioned courage. You've presented a framework that is nothing but common sense and is surprisingly controversial. Let's talk for a minute about the success sequence. First of all, it's thrown about commonly. People assume they understand what it means, but when pressed, what I often hear is, I support. What does that mean again?
Yeah, exactly.
Explain the success sequence.
I will. Let me explain the success sequence, but let me explain the epiphany moment I had on July 11th, 2016 at about 4 p.m.
Please.
when I knew nothing about the success sequence.
Very specific.
It is, well, you know, when you have these epiphany moments, you remember where you were. And so I had been running a network of public charter schools in the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan for 6 years at that point. And our schools were doing great. We had incredible demand, especially in the South Bronx. Each year, so public charter schools, because of the level of demand, there's a lottery system. And so each year, we had maybe 200 open seats for incoming kids, but in the South Bronx, we had nearly 5,000 applicants. So each year we had, you know, we thankfully let the 100 to 200 kids know you've gotten a seat, but then had to tell nearly 5,000 families, almost all low income, the best we could do is put your child's name on this excruciatingly long wait list. And so we decided to have all of the growth, all of our new schools were going to open in the South Bronx. And our headquarters had been in Tribeca in Manhattan, very chic, right on West Broadway. But I made a decision to move our headquarters from West Broadway and Chambers Street to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx, which is it's a pretty tough area. But I said to the team, if this is where we're going to open schools and this is where our kids are, then we should have our schools here as well. You know, we had a needle exchange on the corner, so literally we had drug addicts passing by. But, you know, these kids deserve great schools. So we decided to take a walking tour of the neighborhood to get to know, you know, where's the local deli, where's the local bank. And this is when I had my epiphany moment, which gets me to the success sequence, I promise. As we were walking in the distance, I see this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck. And all of these adults are standing around the truck, very excited. Oh my God, you know, similar to the ice cream truck, when you see kids really excited that this truck is there. And as we get closer on the truck, it's graffiti lettering, and it says, "Who's your daddy?" Like, what's that, right? Well, as we discovered, the Who's Your Daddy truck is a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 and $500 to have these paternity tests done to answer questions like, you know, could you be my sister? Are you my father? Deep questions about identity and family. And obviously, I've been running schools in low-income communities, and you know, I know that family structure has been an issue, but something hit me in that moment, the level of normalcy, the level of acceptance. And frankly, I then discovered that the non-marital birth rate in this particular area of the Bronx was 84%. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't enough. Like running great schools, necessary, but not sufficient. I had to think differently about how my schools could help young people think differently about their future ideas about family formation. So I started doing research about family structure, the role it plays, and then I discovered this guy whose name is Brad Wilcox, who's somewhere in this room. There's Brad right there. And then I discovered the work of Isabel Sawhill and Ron Haskins around this idea called the success sequence, where it was the first time someone had codified a set of ideas and behaviors that perhaps we could teach the next generation. So the success sequence, if you finish just your high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, marriage first. 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. That's not something our students were hearing about. And so we made a determination that that had to be something that we now were teaching the next generation, because you can't control the family that you're from, but you certainly can think differently about the family that you form. And it's one of the most important decisions. It led me on a path to where I am today, and I'm happy to also talk about the challenges we faced in actually trying to implement this in schools.
Yeah, help me with that. You throw out a statistic, 97%.
Yes, not 100%, but pretty close.
By far, the majority of kids who would follow that sequence would avoid poverty.
Yes.
How can that be a controversial conversation?
Well, so remember that word courage I said, when people send you these crazy ideas. So it should be that particularly in a community in which 84% of kids are being born outside of marriage, wouldn't you want to know that there's strategies where 97% of the time within marriage you can avoid poverty if you have children? So when we started teaching this in our middle schools at 8th grade, we faced enormous pushback. You can't teach this to these kids. Their parents didn't follow the success sequence. You'll be offending them. This is too paternalistic. You're trying to impose your values. I'm like, yeah, I'm trying to impose our values. So enormous pushback. And by the way, oftentimes from people who have followed the success sequence in their own personal lives. So they are benefiting from all of the benefits of education, work, marriage, and children, but somehow that is off limits to kids. And so we had to really think about it. A lot of our teachers, administrators, I was just the CEO, trying to push forward this idea. But it takes courage. We live at a time where even something like that has enormous pushback, because what we're trying to, the message that we're trying to send to young people is that you have power. You have the ability to make decisions that can influence your life. It conflicts with the message of oppression and helplessness and dependency. And again, if you're a person who's pushing that narrative, topics like the success sequence are not ones that you want to adopt, because it nullifies the approach that you're trying to say that no, all these people are dependent on my largesse, and we just have to break that.
Let's explore the framework in your book. Everyone has your book. I have a feeling based on this conversation there will be great interest in reading the book.
I hope so.
Let's provide a little preview of FREE. FREE is an acronym, if you notice that on the cover of the book. Let's talk about FREE and what the Free Forum was about today.
Yeah.
Let's talk about these 4 elements, what they mean and how they intersect.
Yeah. Again, a lot of my work is, we can't just shout in the rain and complain about the culture wars, the equity, the fights. What is the empowering alternative that it's on us to show here is a path forward that we think can work? Like, what is it that young people can say yes to? You have to be for something versus always being against. And so I thought long and hard about a lot of the work that I've done over the last 20 to 30 years. And I've been blessed to work in amazing institutions, from the White House to Gates to MTV to running schools. I've worked with every kind of kid. I've worked with rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, kids in homeless shelters. I'm chair of the board of an adoption agency. So I've seen kids in being raised in all sorts of challenging situations: domestic violence, poverty, broken families. And unfortunately, I've seen a number of kids, as they rise into young adulthood, make decisions where they recreate the same disadvantage that they experienced as a child, the same intergenerational cycle of dysfunction, unfortunately. And yet, I've also seen kids in those same conditions execute different types of decisions that put them on a different trajectory where they have broken the cycle of disadvantage. And it's my observation that for those kids who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, what they had in common was this sense of personal agency, that they had a sense that they could lead a self-determined life. But the sense of agency didn't just come from nowhere. It was forged through these 4 pillars that I call free: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. And I'll quickly go through those. Family, even if these kids who broke the cycle of disadvantage were raised in a family that domestic violence or whatever the conditions were, whatever the family they were from, they were on the path to form a very different family, often following the steps related to the success sequence. They had finished their education, work, or on their pathway to be married, but certainly not to have a child within marriage. So that was always the first, and which is why I think it's so important to teach this to young people. So this first idea that young people who broke the cycle of disadvantage recognize that the most consequential decision a human being can make is to bring another human being into the world, and that there are better pathways to do so. And they saw marriage as a cornerstone, not a capstone. And so family was the first anchor that I saw in these kids that changed their trajectory. The second observation was that kids who usually broke the cycle of disadvantage had a moral framework that was usually informed by some kind of religious commitment. Was it Christianity, Buddhism? It almost didn't matter what the organized religion was, but this moral framework, as well as the community that they were part of, had a set of values and tenets that they were expected to live up to. So when they faced tough decisions, they were within a certain sphere of behavior and attitude. And that's one of my observations, that a personal faith commitment, the R in religion, was a part of their story. The third observation was that kids who broke the cycle of disadvantage often benefited from some kind of educational freedom or school choice. Charter school, they had a parent who crawled through broken glass to get them to a really good school, but somehow they went to an educational institution that the parent or caregiver felt gave them a shot. You know, in the district in which I just opened up Vertex, only 7% of kids that started ninth grade in 2015, 4 years later, graduated from high school ready for college. 7%. And this, in a district in New York City right now, there's a cap on charter schools. So even if you had a great idea to open a school to serve the other 93%, you are blocked off from doing that. So, and if you're a kid and you don't even have the ability to get on that rung of success to achieve the first step in the success sequence, it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So that third observation was that kids who broke the cycle of disadvantage benefited from educational freedom. And then the last E of entrepreneurship, if you were on your pathway to build a strong family, if you had a personal faith commitment, if you benefited from educational freedom or school choice, that usually led to this idea that you had an entrepreneurial mindset, that you're a problem solver in your own life, that when challenges came, you could overcome them. And usually entrepreneurship is associated with business, and that includes it, but it's much more this idea that you have the backbone and the strength to take informed risks in your own lives and be a problem solver. And so that's where FREE came from. It's a wonderful acronym, but it's my observation of the kids who were able to develop that sense of personal agency, where it came from, and family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship were the anchor.
Thank you. A promise to the audience and the producer's clock in my head. I knew we were going to run out of time.
Oh.
It's gone even more quickly than I thought, but I have to ask you one last thing.
Yes.
We discussed this prior to the forum this morning, and you mentioned it today in some very interesting comments. So the Free Forum has been held in various communities, Birmingham, Chicago.
Yep.
And we discussed before you came here, you're about to present these principles in Utah where things seem to be working.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit, since public policy, we always need to be mindful of why we enjoy the success and prosperity that we do in a state like Utah. But we can easily forget as we start, misinformation can affect us, agendas can affect us, divisive partisan politics can affect us. By invitation from a Utahn, would you remind us what we need what we need to be aware of, why things work in Utah?
It's very good. You know, we have launched these free forums to go into communities. We started in Birmingham, Alabama. We held a forum in November, and then Chicago, in Washington, in Chicago in December, and then Salt Lake City here. And Birmingham and Chicago are very different than Utah. Very high crime rates, very low educational outcomes, and in many ways, even though there's great activity in both of those cities, but in many ways, the free framework, we're really trying to revitalize each of those institutions. And so the question was, well, why come to Salt Lake City? Because here's, you know, I said the non-marital birth rate in this area of the Bronx that we just opened is 84%. Well, the non-marital birth rate in Salt Lake City is 19%. It's the lowest non-marital birth rate in the country. You know, imagine what would happen in the Bronx if the non-marital birth rate went from 84% to 19%. The community would be transformed positively. Imagine if the non-marital birth rate in Utah went from 19% to 84%. The community would be transformed in my estimation, probably a very destructive way. And Governor Cox, I'm sure you fight tooth and nail to make sure that that didn't happen, right? So you have to recognize that part of this Utah miracle, the reason that Raj Chetty and others have said that this is the #1 city and locality for upward mobility, is that the institutions of free are actually working pretty well here, right? And so we came to Salt Lake City as much to learn from why it is that Utah has had such enormous success, while also still wanting to challenge you to be better. Because, you know, I thought about this earlier. So the non-marital birth rate is 19%, which is the lowest in the country. But what's interesting is that 60 years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a seminal study about the Black family. And he was trying to draw great attention to what he considered a crisis. Because at the time, the non-marital birth rate in the Black community was 23.6%. And he said, this will have enormous negative consequences if this continues. Well, the non-marital birth rate for the Black community across the country is over 70% now. But what's interesting is that even at 19%, so this point about making sure you recognize why you've been able to achieve and make sure you hold on, nothing is guaranteed. Your focus on family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, we need to double down. I made a reference to Jim Collins' book today, Good to Great. That's what I'd love to think about with you as we think about Utah. How do you continue, and good, by the way, the best organizations use the adjective of good, you know? So good to great, because there are other higher levels of greatness that this state can achieve, and we'd love to be partners to help you do that.
Thank you. We have a round of applause for Ian Rowe.